All right, I'm very pleased to introduce you all to Max Wilbert, tonight's speaker. Max is a writer and biocentric community organizer. He has been part of grassroots political work for 20 years and is the co-founder of Protect Thacker Pass, a campaign to protect the natural communities in Thacker Pass, Nevada, from a massive lithium mine. I've been very fortunate to work closely with Max for the past 3 years on this campaign. While Protect Thacker Pass failed to stop mine construction, the campaign has been incredibly successful at engaging a broad coalition of people in a deeper understanding of how lithium mining destroys the land. Max and Protect Thacker Pass continue to work with regional tribes to educate the public about the harms of lithium mining. Max is the author of 2 books, most recently, Bright Green Lies: How the Environmental Movement Lost Its Way and What We Can Do About It. So thank you so much, Max, for taking the time to talk to us tonight about how we respond to ecological overshoot. And with that, I'll hand it over to you.
Okay, thanks so much, Beth. I really appreciate you organizing this. The other presentations have been fantastic in this series, so I definitely recommend folks go back and check those out if you can. Yeah, Beth's an amazing organizer, and for the last 3 years, I've been teasing her about pronouncing the state name Nevada when all the locals call it Nevada. So if you ever find yourself in that neck of the woods, it's Nevada. You'll out yourself as a non-local. Let me share my PowerPoint. I've got some photos and stuff to share with y'all. Is that coming through okay? Okay, great. Okay, so a little more about my background. Beth already did a great introduction, but I've been a grassroots organizer for quite a long time now. I actually got started in anti-racist movements and then in the anti-war movement, the anti-globalization movement, growing up in Seattle. That was a big thing in the post-WTO Battle of Seattle period. And then lastly, the environmental movement. I studied at what was formerly called the Huxley College of the Environment at Western Washington, and I'm currently studying degrowth at a university in Barcelona. So I have been part of different grassroots political work for a long time. This on the upper left is a walk for sacred water, sort of a prayer walk back in, that must have been 2018 or so in Nevada. The upper right is at Thacker Pass. Down in the bottom right is protesting against the tar sands in the state of Utah. And that strange picture in the lower left is at a place called Duvany Yar along the Kolyma River in northern Russia, at the Arctic Circle, essentially. And what you're seeing there is catastrophic climate breakdown. This is a series of permafrost ice wedges thawing incredibly rapidly in the summer of 2010 when I was up there with some climate scientists documenting the work that they were doing, studying Arctic global warming. The Arctic is warming far faster than most of the rest of the planet. So this work has taken me all over the place to some very interesting places, and I've been very lucky to be able to be involved in these different movements. And I'm going to be sharing some of this with you today. So this sums up a lot of my arguments. This is the modern mainstream environmental movement, throwing a plastic bucket of water onto this raging inferno and saying this should do the trick. It's actually worse than this because that's gasoline in the bucket. Oftentimes, mainstream environmentalists think they're trying to solve the problem or make it better, but they're actually making things worse. So I'm not going to cover this in detail because Bill Reese went into this in far more detail and with a lot more expertise and experience and science behind it than I can. But our situation ecologically is bad. It's pretty straightforward. I really don't need to educate you all about this. Interestingly, I think this is important to throw in that a good number of climate scientists actually believe that global warming didn't begin with the Industrial Revolution a couple hundred years ago. It actually began thousands of years ago with the beginning of widespread agriculture, with the beginnings of civilization as we know it, which entailed widespread logging and destruction of natural habitats through plowing of the soil and so on, rice paddy agriculture. And there's actually quite a bit of data to support this. You can see, for example, in the ice core data from Antarctica that you can see the methane levels increase substantially when rice paddy agriculture began in Southeast Asia. So this history is important because when we know the history, when we understand the roots of the problem, we can better predict how it's going to play out in the future. And that allows us to better devise strategy to address these issues. But this presentation is going to focus on today and not the past. And so in the book that I helped author, this book, Bright Green Lies, we make the argument that the environmental movement today has been co-opted, that a movement that was once focused on saving and protecting forests and wetlands and prairies and meadows and grasslands and oceans is now about largely protecting our way of life. It's about finding new ways to sustain a modern, industrial, high-energy, consumeristic way of life into the future. That's the sustainability that we're talking about. So I want to share a few surprising findings from our book. And I want to be clear while I'm doing this, that this is not an argument in favor of fossil fuels. Far from it. I shared that photo from Russia. I'm incredibly concerned. I actually made a film about global warming in the Arctic after that trip, and which is still available on YouTube. It's a little bit embarrassing now because it's nearly 15 years old and it's not the quality of work that I would produce now. But it's on there, and there's some very good interviews with some of the top climate scientists who specialize in warming in the Arctic. And I have dedicated much of my work to fighting fossil fuels, whether it's blockading coal trains, fighting the tar sands, working to fight pipelines alongside indigenous communities, and so on. So this is not about promoting fossil fuels. It's about being honest about the harms caused by many of the green technologies that are being promoted by the mainstream environmental movement. So with that in mind, this is a little known fact. I actually had to dig this out of the raw data of a scientific paper looking at projected habitat destruction in the next 20 years, 20 to 30 years. And the data showed that renewables are expected to be the #1 cause of habitat destruction, as much land potentially as urban sprawl, oil and gas production, coal and mining combined by 2050. So that's new destruction. That's not about what's already been done in the past, but it's that this data is a comparison of what's coming down the pipeline. And it helps us to understand the massive scale of expansion in renewable energy projects that's threatening some habitat on this planet, a substantial amount of habitat. Solar panel production is one of the leading sources of some very potent greenhouse gases, such as solar hexafluoride. Wind turbines kill birds and especially bats in large numbers. Some bat species could go extinct just with the wind turbines that we already have installed around the planet. And with greater numbers of wind turbines being built, this problem could get far worse. Wind turbines blades are made from plastics. New energy sources generally are not displacing the old energy sources. There are quite a few scientific papers that back this up. Renewables are adding on top of fossil fuels. So as we're seeing more wind and solar energy be built and deployed, we're seeing very small scale declines in the increasing demand for fossil fuels. So more and more fossil fuels are still being burned every year, generally speaking, aside from the coronavirus blip in the data that reduced fossil fuel demand. But the demand for and burning of fossil fuels is trending up and up and up. And renewable energy is perhaps slowing down that demand increase slightly, but it is not stabilizing or reducing the situation. And this is backed up again by the data. Renewable energy technologies often create a lot of toxic waste at the end of their usable life. Dams, which many people look at as sources of green energy, are big producers of methane, which is a very potent greenhouse gas. They're also, of course, implicated in massive declines in the populations of anadromous fish like salmon. I live in the Pacific Northwest of the United States, and it's salmon country here, but the salmon are endangered. Many of the runs are gone already, and it's largely because of the dam, among other issues such as overfishing. And of course, there are plans to mine the deep sea to extract more materials for green technologies. So this is the industrialization of a whole new region of the planet that has been harmed in many cases by trawling and plastic pollution and other issues. But this is some of the last true wilderness left on the planet. So what does this all mean in practice? So I made this chart a decade ago when I began giving public talks on this topic, and it's just a general comparison of fossil fuels and green technologies. The important, don't bother to read all the details here. The important part of this is to realize that I wrote it the same on both sides. Both green tech and fossil fuels require large-scale, unsustainable extraction of metals and other resources. Both are globalized industrial production processes requiring energy-intensive technologies. Both contribute to resource conflicts, exploitation of labor, and human rights violations worldwide. The only difference between these two sides in this chart, which is, this is generalized. This is not very specific, as you can see. But under fossil fuels, it says pollution often visible at the site of consumption. And under green tech, it says pollution often invisible at the site of consumption. So of course, there are greenhouse gas differences if you do a direct comparison between a certain amount of energy produced by solar versus a certain amount of energy produced by coal. There's greenhouse gas differences, there's air pollution differences, and so on. But the point that I'm trying to make here is that both of these technologies are destructive. They involve taking materials from the planet, refining them in these often very polluting practices, and then building them in factories, assembling these products and distributing them around the world via supply chains, which are themselves very polluting and destructive. So my argument here is really simple. Unless we address the root problems that we're facing, destruction of the planet, overconsumption, overpopulation, overshoot, the topic of this series, we may end up having a slower apocalypse by adopting green technologies. That may be all they are able to achieve, is a slightly slower apocalypse. That's not what I want. So that was a lot of data, a lot of words on slides, and probably half of you are asleep by now. So let's show some pretty pictures, see if I can wake you up. This is a place called Bahamaha in the Paiute language. It's also known as Thacker Pass in English. It's in northern Nevada. And it is a place that was formed about 16 million years ago in its present form when the Yellowstone hotspot was in this region and causing a lot of volcanic activity. So this place is incredibly beautiful. It's part of the Sagebrush Sea, which means that there are no trees across most of Thacker Pass. It's an ecosystem that only gets about as high as your waist, mostly dominated by sagebrush, but it's home to a vast array of wildlife. It's a very rich and biodiverse ecosystem. As you can see here on the left, these folded layers of rocks show off that volcanic history of the land. And these tracks along the edge of the snow here are actually cougar tracks. This was the winter of 2022 that I was tracking this cougar on top of the mountain up there. It's a place of extremes, extremely cold and snowy in the winter, hot and dry in the summer, windy all year round. A place with massive skies that are incredibly dark in the evenings and the clear nights when the Milky Way just lights up the entire sky. It's a place that's largely unaffected by human beings. It's been impacted by grazing. There are a few roads, dirt roads, that have been punched through. It's not pristine, almost nowhere on Earth is, but it's functional habitat for a huge array of wildlife. And it's a place where you can turn around 1 minute and the light has completely changed, and all of a sudden the beauty of the place just grabs you and takes your breath away. It can be incredibly awe-inspiring. It's a place where there are mountain ranges stretching on all sides to almost 10,000 feet, over 3,000 meters, and a place where some of the most beautiful sunsets I've ever seen in my life. It's a place that some people look at and call a wasteland, but I think it's a worse word could not be chosen to describe this place. This is one of the creeks flowing through the area in the spring at sunset, and you can see the sagebrush growing on either side of the creek. I like to call the sagebrush an old growth forest that never gets more than about 3 or 4 feet tall. So these bushes can be several hundred years old, and they sustain a whole diversity of plants and animals who live around them, including wildflowers in the spring, insects, the birds, and other animals that survive on those insects, a massive rodent population, burrowing owls. There are actually Pacific tree frogs who live in this creek. I was shocked when I heard them singing in the springtime. And as you can see, I just can't describe the beauty of the place. Something you really have to see. So Thacker Pass is also home to a lot of wildlife. I already mentioned some of them. This is a rock dove, beautiful rock dove I had an encounter with out there. Bobcat tracks in the snow, killdeer nesting out there. This is a shorebird, but they're nesting out in the middle of what you could call the desert. This is an American kestrel, horned lark's nest that I stumbled across one day walking through the sagebrush. I wouldn't have gotten this close to the nest otherwise, but I looked down and it was right at my feet. So I snapped a quick picture and then got out of there to give them their privacy. Pocket gopher, lots of nocturnal and subterranean life in places like this. Ferruginous hawk, the largest hawk species in North America. These are pronghorn antelope. This is the only species of antelope in North America and the fastest land animal on the continent, the second fastest in the world, actually, after the African cheetah. Their closest relatives are giraffes, actually. Herd of mule deer on a beautiful morning out there. These are sage grouse, greater sage grouse, these incredible birds who have this mating process, this mating ritual in springtime where the males gather every year in these same locations called leks. And they gather in these roughly circular areas, 50 or 100 yards across, and they sing this incredible sort of warbling aquatic sound made by these two air-filled sacs in their chests that they inflate and then sort of bounce against each other. And this sound echoes out. This is all happening right at dawn, at sunrise, echoes out across the land, and the females come flying in from all directions. One of the most incredible and eerie and unusual things I've ever seen. And they're struggling really badly right now. Sage grouse populations are down about 99%. This is a rattlesnake on the left, jackrabbit on the right. Porcupine up in the tree. There are a few trees here and there where there's water. This is a western fence lizard who hung out with us up there quite a bit. We named him Itchy because he kept scratching the back of his head. These lizards are pretty fascinating because in areas where they live, the rates of Lyme disease are substantially lower because when ticks who are infected with Lyme disease bite these lizards, the lizard's blood actually kills the pathogen that causes Lyme disease. So then the tick drops off, reproduces, and its offspring also don't have Lyme disease. And this is a benefit of having Western fence lizards around. They also live here where I live in Oregon. Alligator lizard, some of the insect life out there, praying mantis, and this incredible pink and yellow moth. More cougar tracks, just because how cool is that? And the beauty of the sunset on rabbit brush, the Milky Way rising over wild land, storms moving through Thacker Pass, rainbows, more of the beautiful light on the cliffs in the late winter. The vast landscape. But of course, I don't want you all to be distracted by these beautiful photos, because destroying Thacker Pass, if you would believe the words of the mining company and also of many mainstream environmental organizations, destroying Thacker Pass, destroying that place, is actually good for the planet. So according to the mining company, environmental leadership is a core value. We recognize that the success of our operations must be underpinned by our commitment to sustainable business practices. We do this by responsibly managing our impacts. Thacker Pass is designed and engineered to minimize its environmental footprint, to avoid sensitive habitat, and to employ the best available environmental control technologies. So that's what the mining company says. Let's see what that looks like on the ground. This is a drone video that was taken in late August or early September. Somebody sent it to me. And what you're seeing here is biotic cleansing. You're seeing the sagebrush habitat, which has been bulldozed and piled up into these long rows here. They're destroying all the life in Thacker Pass down to the bacterial level, essentially sterilizing much of the soil by destroying the biological soil crusts that protect the soil against UV radiation and desiccation and so on, and exposing it to the environment. All that biodiverse old growth sagebrush, all the creatures who live there, the burrowing owls, the sage grouse, the pronghorn antelope, the migratory birds, the cougars. So all those animals and plants have been either killed directly or driven off this habitat here. This is, oops, go to the next slide. This is one of the trucks that they're using to mine at Thacker Pass. This has a 350-gallon fuel tank for diesel fuel to power green extraction of lithium. And this mine would, this is a map of the mine that they're trying to build out at Thacker Pass. So the massive open pit in the upper left, a half-mile across, 2.5 miles long, and the height of a 40-story building deep into the earth. A giant pile right here, the clay tailings filter stack in the center. That's the toxic waste pile. Essentially just pile it up in a big mound, put some plastic underneath it, and hope it doesn't leak. And this mine would produce massive amounts of pollution. You're talking 11,000 plus gallons of fuel being burned every day, and carbon emissions equivalent to about a small city. So some other impacts of this lithium mine. And again, this is lithium for electric vehicles. So according to the environmental impact statement, the mine would use this huge amount of sulfuric acid per day. Most sulfur comes from oil and gas refineries, where it's pulled out of high sulfur fuels like tar sands oil as part of air quality regulations. So that sulfur then gets sold to other industries, and the Thacker Pass mine would use about the mass of 2 Empire State Buildings each year in sulfur sourced from the oil industry, the oil refining industry, to produce lithium for electric cars. So this is just one illustration of how these technologies are not really separate. Um, Ozzy Zahner, who's an engineer, calls them alternative fossil fuels rather than alternative energies, recognizing situations like this, where you have fossil fuel powered mining trucks digging out a material, using fossil fuel inputs to convert it into battery grade lithium, and then building electric vehicles, which are powered from a grid that has many interties to fossil fuel power plants. Um, and putting those batteries in cars that are built using a lot of fossil fuel energy, including to do things like smelt the steel and so on. So this is an electric vehicle. This is just a chart comparing some of the materials in electric vehicles in the middle to internal combustion engine or gasoline, diesel powered cars on the left. Fuel cell cars are on the right, but we're not discussing those here. The point of this slide is just to show the scope of materials that are in these vehicles. You've got steel, cast iron, copper, glass, plastic, rubber. In some cases, you have things like PTFE. This is a very toxic chemical that is basically similar to Teflon or the membranes that are used in Gore-Tex jackets and other waterproof jackets. There's been a lot of controversy around the company DuPont and the amount of pollution that they've caused producing these chemicals around the world. Other substances like nickel. This graph actually doesn't show the up-to-date information for nickel because EV batteries today are using quite a bit of nickel, and it shows 0 in this chart. I think this is from 2015 or so. So today there's about 75 pounds of nickel used in the average electric vehicle. And I want to talk about nickel briefly because this is the island of Halmahera, which is in Indonesia. And this is where transnational mining companies are doing, as you can see in this photo here, they're doing what's essentially mountaintop removal mining to extract nickel, specifically for electric vehicle batteries. And I think this is particularly important and illustrative and outrageous because this island is home to an indigenous tribe who have chosen to live in a largely traditional way on this island. They are essentially hunter-gatherers, some horticulture, but they're living with no debt, no prisons, no bombs, no modern technology, no drug addiction, no income inequality, none of the trappings of modern civilization. It's just people living sustainably on the land, and they are being driven out as we speak today for nickel mining to create electric car batteries for wealthy consumers around the world. So the point here is that electric vehicles are not good for the planet. And this exact same analysis, looking at the raw materials, looking at the supply chains, can be applied to other technologies, whether we're talking about solar panels, wind turbines, natural gas pipelines, smartphones, laptops, computer servers, gasoline-powered cars, any modern technology, a light bulb in this lamp right next to me. We could do the exact same thing, and we would likely find a lot of violence. This is why I often repeat that civilization is based on violence. Oftentimes that violence is made invisible. The American Indian author Jack Forbes, who was Lenape, he was a brilliant man, wrote some great books, including Columbus and Other Cannibals. And in that book, he wrote that maintaining an empire is often less violent or less visibly violent than expanding an empire. And he was using this to compare the British Empire during World War II to the Nazi regime. And he was arguing that the amount of violence that it took to build and expand the British Empire was just as atrocious as the amount of violence that the Nazis were visiting on the world. But the British Empire's violence had largely taken place in the past. And so it was normalized. So this is something that I think is an important consideration when we look at what's happening around the planet today. So much of the violence is invisibilized. And that violence is leading us deeper into a state of ecological collapse. So this is Linda Hogan, a brilliant Chickasaw author. Her book, Solar Storms, is life-changing, and I highly recommend it. And she says, progress is a sort of madness that is a god to people. So we're trapped in what some people call a progress trap, which means the deeper we go, the worse our problem gets. The more our environmental impact expands and we accelerate deeper into ecological collapse. Albert Einstein actually said a very similar thing. How conceivable that all our allotted technological progress, our very civilization, is like the axe in the hands of a pathological criminal. So now we're going to start moving into the next step of this presentation, which is really what I wanted to focus on. So everything up to this point has been largely background material, providing some analysis that I think most of you who are on this call probably already know to some degree. If you're questioning the mainstream environmental movement, if you're questioning the ability of green technology to save us, then you are welcome here. You are among friends. If this is a new analysis for you, then you're very welcome as well, because I used to believe this stuff was going to save us too, believe it or not. The propaganda and the propaganda is very sophisticated, and it works very well because we want it to be true. We want to believe that we can have all the conveniences of our modern technology, that we can have everything that we enjoy about modern industrial civilization, and that we can have it in a sustainable way. And that's the promise of green technology. And it's fundamentally a lie. But we believe it because we want it to be true. Now, as adults, we have to be the people who are willing to face uncomfortable truths. Sometimes we don't get what we want, and this is one of those cases. So this is why we wrote the book Bright Green Lies. This is the fundamental reason, because these technologies, these technological solutions are leading us in the wrong direction. We've gotten distracted into focusing on green tech, right? Because it's easy to believe in, right? It doesn't require us to change our way of life. It's also incredibly profitable. There are trillions of dollars at stake here, and the largest corporations in the world are making major moves to cash in on that. We're seeing massive government subsidies going to corporations that are investing in wind and solar energy and electric vehicle production, battery production, grid expansions and upgrades, energy storage, and so on. So this is a cash cow for the largest corporations on the planet right now. And it's a big transfer of wealth from private hands to corporate hands, because those subsidies are being paid for by our tax money. So what are the alternatives? If green tech isn't going to save us, what the hell should we be focused on instead? So there are two answers as far as I'm concerned. This is a map from Ashish Kothari, who's an Indian scholar who's looking at some of these efforts around the world. So two parts. This slide is about the first part of the answer. And this is something that Bill Reese talked about in his first presentation in this series. It's something that Jeremy Jimenez talked about as well. And that is the importance of community organizing to relocalize our food systems and prepare our communities and our governments and our societies for rapid and widespread degrowth. And we're really talking in the rich countries, certainly, we're talking about 80, 90, 95% reductions in energy and material use in a pretty rapid span of time if we want to reach sustainability. So our societies right now are completely dependent on fossil fuels and the destruction of the planet for basic necessities like food, medicine, housing, right? And that's not even to mention the massive amount of waste that's going into unnecessary non-essential goods and services. So that needs to change. And we're talking about massive public mobilizations to pressure governments, build political parties, build alternative institutions. Some people talk about the term dual power. And there are quite a few examples of communities that are doing this type of work. We've got the permaculture movement and agroecology movements, transition town movements, lots of people working on issues of family planning and overpopulation, the degrowth movement, Buen Vivir down in South America, which describes a way of looking at things, sort of a way of building culture that is community-centric and ecologically balanced. We can look at what nations like Bhutan are doing in centering their national policy and goals around happiness and incorporating ecological measures of well-being into that, rather than looking at GDP as a measure of well-being and economic growth as their yardstick for success. And other communities like Kerala and Ladakh in India, there are many areas of the world where people are at different scales, from individual households to towns, regions, and even whole nations, are attempting to live in different ways and attempting to build ways of existing on the planet that are low energy, that are localized, that are mostly self-sufficient, that support and sustain the ecology around them, and so on. So there are legitimate critiques of all these movements, but they represent the seeds of other ways of living. And I think that's absolutely beautiful and essential. So you might look at this map and think, wonderful, we've got all these alternatives, the problem is solved. And unfortunately, you'd be wrong, because there are two main issues here. And I mean this completely as not critiques of these movements, but as analysis of the broader situation. So one, the dominant culture deliberately destroys alternatives to itself because they are perceived as threats. So when, to use a historical example, when European colonists showed up in North America, they encountered a continent largely made up of people living more or less sustainable ways of life at a small scale with localized food production and different types of governance, but often a lot of direct democracy and freedom and autonomy. And they deliberately destroyed those communities to incorporate them into a non-sustainable empire of expansion and economic growth. So that process is largely continuing today. Look at Halmahera Island and what's happening to those tribal communities right now. Their land is being destroyed, and when their food sources are destroyed, they will have no choice but to die or to join the culture that destroyed them. That is happening all over the world, not just in Indonesia. This is a process that some scholars have called forced proletarianization. It's the removal of people from self-sustaining small-scale ways of life and forcing them into the economy, into the capitalist economy. And not just the capitalist economy, the process is played out very much the same in places like China as well, although some would argue that China is essentially a capitalist nation as well. I'm not going to get into that. So this is also happening at smaller scales, right? If you are working to provide free, sustainable, low-cost housing from local building materials like cob building and straw bale houses and so on, and you're scaling this to the point where you're reducing demand for concrete and lumber and the normal type of conventional housing, you are a threat to the profits of developers, of housing developers. And they will work to criminalize the work that you are doing or otherwise undermine it. The same goes for local food sustainability efforts, right? At a certain point, if you're scaling, you represent a threat to industrial agricultural interests, and those interests will work to undermine you. So that's the first problem. So the second problem is this: the growth of the growth culture is outpacing the recruitment and change-making ability of the alternatives. So what I mean by this is that we are seeing energy use, habitat destruction, species extinction, greenhouse gases, plastic production, all these measures of how bad things are. All these issues are getting worse year after year. The problems are accelerating, right? So they're not continuing along at an unsustainable but steady level. They're getting worse every year. We're seeing this hockey stick graph, right? We've all seen the hockey stick graph looking at greenhouse gas emissions. The graph applies to all these other issues as well. More than half of all plastic ever produced has been made in something like the last 15 years. So these problems are accelerating rapidly. And that means that this point is by definition correct. The growth of the growth culture is outpacing the recruitment and change-making ability of the alternatives. It's not happening fast enough. Okay. The problem here is not that our movements are necessarily doing something wrong. It's that there's people working on the other side as well, right? There are millions of very high-paid people applying trillions of dollars in resources, entire governments working to increase economic growth, increase energy production, increase global population, and push all these issues in the wrong direction, right? It's happening deliberately. This is one example. Here's a in-depth academic paper that's looking at how mining companies are using techniques like counterinsurgency developed in war zones and similar techniques to create social license to operate in northern Portugal for lithium mining companies. So this basically means they're working to undermine the opposition to the mines. They're working to bribe the communities to get them to buy into the mines and so on. It's a deliberate process. That's the only argument I'm trying to make here. It's not an accident that we have unsustainability, that we have the destruction of the planet going on. This is a deliberate process. So we need those alternatives. We need those other ways to live. We need that being built, but we also need resistance. So we can look at Thacker Pass as both an illustrative and a cautionary example. My friend Will Falk and I launched Protect Thacker Pass in January of 2021. We set up camp up here. Beth was a big part of helping us do that as well. We were camping in this little teepee tent on the side of a mountain a mile above sea level in the winter, cold as hell, right in the middle of the GPS coordinates of the mine site. And we began to coordinate with allies and organize with communities in the area. We helped local tribes to launch a federal court case against the mine's permit. This is the steps of the federal courthouse building in Reno, Nevada. That court case was actually won by the mining company a month ago. And we participated in some nonviolent civil disobedience to block the construction of the mine and raise awareness of the issue. To try and get the government to take action on these issues in hopes that something would change. So what were the results on this? We got a lot of press. We were in the New York Times and Le Monde and BBC and CNN, all the rest. We did hundreds of media interviews. We brought thousands of people out to Thacker Pass. But the backlash was swift and strong. The federal government is fining my friend Will Falk and I nearly $50,000. We're currently fighting that fine. The mining company has also sued myself and 6 other land defenders, which means we could be fined millions of dollars, and we are currently risking felony charges if we even go into Thacker Pass. We're currently in the midst of this lawsuit right now. And as you saw from that drone footage I shared earlier, the land is being destroyed in Thacker Pass as we speak. So we were not successful in stopping this mine. So what are the lessons here? I think the legal failures in this case illustrate a need for action and tactics that go beyond the law. And specifically, I think we need large-scale nonviolent direct action. So I want to share a few examples of this. On the upper left here, this is the, I'm not probably going to pronounce this right, the Ande Gelande movement in Germany, which has been an ongoing direct action campaign against one of the largest coal mines in Europe. You can see the irony of the wind turbines in the background of one of the largest coal mines. And the upper right is the valve turners. There have been a lot of valve turners actually, but this particular action was part of a October 2016 action in which 5 people coordinated to simultaneously shut down 4 oil pipelines across 4 different states that were all bringing tar sands oil from Canada into the United States. And they basically scouted out these remote pump stations, cut through a lock to get into the facility, and then closed a valve. They literally just turned this wheel and it shut down the oil flow. These people did this sort of publicly. They did it clandestinely. They snuck in there and so on, but then they waited to get arrested. And they had to wait for quite a while because they achieved total surprise. Nobody knew they were coming. But in that one action, they shut down 15% of the oil coming into the United States. So probably the single most effective environmental action in US history. Of course, the pipelines were turned back on within not too long, but nonetheless, an interesting and noteworthy action. In the lower left, you've got the Unistoten camp and the Giddimden checkpoint, which is in Western Canada. A series of several First Nations peoples have opposed oil and gas pipeline development crossing through their traditional territory. These pipelines would cross over salmon streams that are so pure that you can just cup your hands and drink the water out of the river. I visited the territory a few times and had the privilege of doing that. And they set up camp, started restricting access to pipeline company workers, claimed this bridge on which this photo is taken, and decided to hold the territory. In the lower right, this is a mass protest in Serbia against a lithium mine, Rio Tinto lithium mine. And this protest involved about 100,000 people. They shut down every major highway in the capital city. And there were farmers out in the area that they wanted to mine who said they would fight to the death to protect their land from this mining company. So I want to note as well about this slide that only one of these fights has been successful so far, and that's the Serbia fight in the bottom right. The pipeline through the Unistoten territory was completed about 2 months ago, and will probably begin carrying natural gas, fracked gas, quite soon. The tar sands pipelines that the valve turners targeted are still operating today and carrying oil into the United States. And the coal mine in the upper left is still active. In fact, they just destroyed an entire village to make way for an expansion of that coal mine this past summer in Germany. So the fact that these movements generally aren't having a great success rate is leading people to more radical tactics. And that's what I'm going to talk about now. So we've seen a big shift in media on the topic of eco-sabotage lately. So on the left is a film called Woman at War that came out probably 4 or 5 years ago. An excellent film. I highly recommend it. It revolves around a woman sabotaging high voltage power transmission lines that were supplying energy to aluminum smelters. This is in Iceland. Much of the world's aluminum smelting happens in Iceland because electricity is incredibly cheap there, because hydropower and geothermal energy is very abundant. And this smelting is very destructive to the land. And of course, that aluminum is shipped all over the world for use in destructive industries. So a very interesting film. In the middle, this new film called How to Blow Up a Pipeline came out recently. I haven't actually seen it, so I don't know how it is. And on the right, Kim Stanley Robinson, American science fiction author, wrote this book, The Ministry for the Future, recently. I very much recommend it. It's a fascinating case study in how the future could play out. But one of the elements in the book that I found most fascinating was an active underground movement committing eco-sabotage actions against the fossil fuel industry. So people are recognizing that these radical tactics are becoming increasingly in face of the crisis that we're in media. It's happening in real life. It's happening in the real world. On the left here is Jessica Resnicek, who sabotaged the Dakota Access Pipeline in 2016 during the Standing Rock No DAPL movement. Jessica's currently serving a, I believe, 8-year prison sentence for her acts of sabotage. Her and another woman, their small scale acts of sabotage probably stopped the pipeline about as effectively as 30,000 people did through their knowledge. And I don't say that to talk down about the nonviolent direct action, but merely to illustrate what a few people can do with more radical tactics. In the middle here, this is a news story that was published in Harper's recently about a guy named Stephen McRae, who has been, he recently got out of prison, served some time for sabotaging energy infrastructure. And then on the right is a man named Wiebo Ludwig, who sabotaged a bunch of oil and gas infrastructure in Canada in the late 1990s. A lot more of this is probably happening than we know about. Oftentimes, when industrial facilities are sabotaged, the companies do not report it to the media because they don't want to inspire any sort of copycat attacks. But this type of stuff actually does happen. And it doesn't just happen in North America, it's happening around the world. So these photos on the top here are the Ka'apor, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correct, the Ka'apor tribe in the Amazon rainforest. They have formed essentially a task force, an armed task force to resist illegal logging in their territory. They capture the loggers, burn and destroy their equipment, and then run them out of their territory. So they're not actually causing any serious long-term harm or killing these people, but they are tying them up and giving them a hell of a scare and sending them on their way and sending them off with dire warnings. So they're defending their territory. In Chiapas, Mexico, many of you probably know the story of the Zapatistas doing what was essentially a nonviolent revolution, where they were armed and they seized their territory back from the Mexican state and the transnational corporations, attempting to privatize large portions of it. But they did so without firing a shot. So it was a armed, nonviolent revolution, and they've continued to run their territory as essentially an autonomous zone within Mexico ever since, prioritizing human rights, justice, and sustainability within their territory. And in the lower left, this is the movement for the emancipation of the Niger Delta, which Nigeria is the largest oil producing state in Africa. They have had the equivalent of an Exxon Valdez sized oil spill every year for over half a century. That's the scale of the pollution that the oil industry has visited on the vast wetland of the Niger River Delta. And this film, Sweet Crude, that the poster is in the center here, that's a fantastic film about the situation in the Niger Delta. I highly recommend watching that film. So people are fighting back. Regardless of whether or not we want this to happen, or we think it's the right way, or we approve of it morally, it's happening. And it represents an increasing radicalization that's taking place because of the circumstances that are playing out in the world today, because of the development of this situation, of this contradiction between modern industrial society and the natural world. And it's happening because Governments are failing to address these problems because our processes of democracy and voting and progression of these issues. People are resorting to more radical and extreme measures because they feel they have no other option. Because the government, the bureaucratic systems, the corporations are not stopping the destruction of the planet. They are just accelerating it. So, how do we respond to this? And I think the response is that we align ourselves with the natural world. So, again, the question here that's very important is about the morality of these more radical actions. And I think it's very important to recognize that the morality in these situations is often dictated by external circumstances. It's not up to the local communities. So, what do I mean by that? So, if you've studied the history of the resistance to apartheid in South Africa, then you will know that there was a nonviolent, above ground resistance to apartheid for many decades. And that largely coalesced under the ANC, the African National Congress. Now, what some of you may not know is that the ANC was outlawed by the apartheid state. Membership in the ANC was made illegal. Rallies were outlawed. The group was forbidden from gathering, from organizing, from passing out pamphlets, from speaking to the media, from participating in any sort of democratic or community organizing process. In response to that, the group they had two choices, either give up or go underground. And they chose to go underground. So Nelson Mandela, who many of us, for some reason, think of as a paragon of nonviolence, Nelson Mandela was actually the head of an underground army called the Umkhonto we Sizwe, the Spear of the Nation. And they actually sabotaged industrial infrastructure in South Africa. And they did other things like even assassinations. The morality of those actions can be debated by historians, but the broader morality of opposing the apartheid state and the policies that they were promoting, there's no debate about that, of course. Nelson Mandela famously, when he was in court, said, "I do not deny that I planned sabotage. I did not do it out of the spirit of recklessness, but only after a long and sober assessment of the oppression of my people by the whites." This is what happens when other avenues are foreclosed or when they're shown to be ineffective in stopping what's happening. The same situation could be said of the example in the lower left of this slide, the movement for the emancipation of the Niger Delta. There was a vibrant, nonviolent movement to stop Shell Oil Company in Nigeria for many, many years. It was led by Ken Saro-Wiwa, who was a poet and a community organizer and activist. And in November 1995, him and 10 other leaders of this movement had been arrested by the military dictatorship of Nigeria with the collaboration of Shell Oil Company, and they were executed by hanging on trumped up charges. So this was seen around the world as a massive violation of human rights at the time, and this led directly to the creation of the movement for the emancipation of the Niger Delta. Arundhati Roy wrote about this issue when she wrote several essays on the Naxalites, who are an armed group in central India. They call themselves Maoists, but most of their body is made up of indigenous peoples. And their ideology incorporates a lot of the indigenous ideas of these tribes of central India as well. And Arundhati Roy traveled into the forest where the Naxalites are organizing, including against a lot of mining and agribusiness companies trying to privatize these lands that these tribes have lived on for millennia. And she said that fighting people will choose their own weapons. She said that nonviolent protests can only work if there is an audience. and if that audience can be moved to take action, and if that action can actually change the situation. And that's not the case in the jungle, right? So my point here is that different tactics are going to be effective in different situations, right? And it's also that this type of radical action is completely interdependent with the development of alternatives that I discussed earlier. Okay, so that was a lot. So I'm gonna wrap up here. So we are in this time of converging crisis, right? And it's clear that the systemic means of changing and addressing these issues are not functioning. They've proven themselves inadequate. It doesn't mean these methods are worthless, but they're inadequate. And that is why I'm a revolutionary. Years ago, I gave a talk to a group of Marxists who asked me to speak to their group. I don't call myself a Marxist personally, but I'm willing to talk to anyone about these issues from across the political spectrum. And what I told them is that the traditional Marxist strategy, socialist strategy, is for the workers to seize the means of production. And what I told them that what has changed in this situation is that we now have an understanding through science, through ecology, through traditional ecological knowledge, that the means of production, the machinery, the factories, the pipelines, the power transmission lines, and so on, these are actually the problem. These are the tools that are being used to destroy our planet. And so we don't need to seize the means of production. We actually need to dismantle the means of production, specifically these industrial means of production. The modern environmental movement was once a revolutionary movement. When it began, the environmental movement self-consciously understood itself as existing in opposition to industrial capitalism, to growth, to empire, and to this society that we live in, this modern techno-industrial culture of consumerism. That has changed. The modern environmental movement now is completely aligned with some of the wealthiest and most powerful interests on this planet. We need to return to our roots. There is room for all kinds of people in this movement. I laid out in this slide 6 of the most important tasks that I think we need to be working on and focusing on going forward. And I want to make clear that despite the fact that I am calling for these radical actions, that I'm discussing these radical actions, only a small percentage of people are actually equipped to take that type of radical action on the front lines. And that is okay. Most people are going to be doing support work behind the scenes in one way or another. For example, myself, by talking publicly about these issues, by being willing to address them, I have put a target on my chest in more ways than one. And that in some ways precludes me from taking certain actions that may be more dangerous or more risky, because I know that I'm being monitored by certain forces who don't want this type of agenda to be advanced. That's okay. I'm doing my support work. I'm building a culture of resistance in the ways that I can. And my point is that all of us can contribute to this movement in one way or another. But we all have to take action. We all have to think big, and we all have to help transform our society from the top to the bottom. So the final point I want to make, and then I'd love to hear people's questions, is that this may sound very radical to you, but this is not radical, actually, in the sense of being extreme. This is actually a very reasonable and rational response to the problems we are facing. What's extreme, what's radical, is to think that business as usual can continue with no long-term ramifications. What's radical and what's extreme is to think that growth can continue indefinitely. And what's radical and extreme is to think that green technologies are going to save us from the problems created by industrial technology. There's actually no evidence to support that contention. So this may sound radical to some, but it really isn't. My friend often says that it's basic math. If you have one living planet and you destroy it, that's 1 minus 1. That's it. Thanks for coming, everyone. I'd love to hear any questions or discussion.
Thank you so much, Max. That was fantastic. I have a question for you. You showed the picture of the activists in Serbia, 100,000 of them fighting back against the lithium mine there. And as we know, there was not 100,000 people protesting at Thacker Pass against the Thacker Pass lithium mine. And so I'm really curious about your thoughts on why Serbia was able to mobilize 100,000 people and we at Protect Thacker Pass were not.
It's a really good question. I think it comes down a lot to cultural differences. I think the circumstance was a lot different in some ways, politically, because some great organizers who had some political power got in very early to the situation in Serbia and started building a movement rather quickly. They got started earlier in the permitting process. So for example, if if we had started at the same time they had, then we would have started maybe 2 or 3 years earlier in our campaign. So they got ahead of the situation. And I think that the United States is profoundly individualistic in a way that almost no other nations in the world are. Um, Serbia and many other places around the world still have a functioning sense of community. Serbians come from Serbia and have lived there for thousands of years. They have multi-generational community. They have roots on the land. They have linkages to the land and to the soil and to particular places and villages and farms and communities there. And that's not something that most people have in the United States. And that makes it very difficult to organize around these types of issues. So I'd say those were some of the deciding factors, but I'm sure there are more that I'm not aware of.
Yeah, thank
Great
you.
question.
We have a question from the chat. What's your sense of the current state of the degrowth movement, especially now from within the master's program that you're now in? How do they rationalize a modest green transition, which isn't as decolonizing and biocentric as your vision? Is it evolving at all?
Great question, Andrea, and good to see you here. One thing that I have been rather pleased by in getting started in this program and getting to know some more people from around the world is that the degrowth umbrella is rather broader than I thought it was at first. There are a few voices, mostly based in the West and in Europe, who are the loudest and get the most media attention in the degrowth world. And so it's easy for people to take their policy proposals and ideas and strategies as being sort of the degrowth way. But there's actually a very broad swath of people, many of whom do fall on the more radical side, like me, or should I say on the more moderate side. um, and those voices out there are out there. They're kind of being drowned out. And so one of the reasons I'm doing the program is in hopes of building alliances and relationships with those folks and lifting up this type of more biocentric vision, as you say. As far as how do people rationalize a sort of modest green transition, just so people are aware, many people are promoting the idea that we could all live sort of a modest European lifestyle, and that this should be done by the wealthiest people in the world, the wealthiest nations in the world, reducing their consumption significantly, and therefore allowing the poorest people in the world to increase their consumption to increase basic levels of well-being and so on. Personally, I find that approach rather Eurocentric and pretty culturally blinkered and myopic. I think that there are so many ways of living that are completely outside of that paradigm that are worth that have inherent worth and value. One example that I'd give of this is there was this Associated Press story that came out years ago, and I saved the link because it was so I thought it was so moving. I can actually share the link here. Yeah, here we go. I'll share the link in the chat. This is it's from a some sort of UN conference in 2016, and there's this indigenous leader, I believe, from the Kogi peoples in what's now called Colombia, up in the mountains there. And she says in this that she says, okay, I'll quote it directly. She says, "We are fighting not to have roads or electricity." I'll repeat that. We are fighting not to have roads or electricity. This vision of self-destruction that's called development is what we're trying to avoid. And that is really difficult for people to understand, because many of us in this culture especially have this idea that there are so many benefits that are um, undeniable from Western civilization. And from a certain perspective, there are, right? You can't deny the power of modern medicine and the blah, 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 these different things, right? But there are many communities around the world that during the process of colonization have had a very intellectually rich understanding of the fact that there are very serious costs associated with the transition from a traditional way of life to even a modest modern way of life, even if those transitions bring things like reductions in child mortality, um, which is very tragic. I don't mean to diminish the impacts of these issues, but I mean to point out that it would be, uh, as I said, Eurocentric and I believe very arrogant to say that people like this woman, this Kogi woman interviewed in this Associated Press article, are somehow stupid or quaint for not wanting the benefits of modern society. And when we contemplate the fact that producing the technologies necessary for even this modest European green transition vision involves significant and widespread destruction of the planet and the natural world, including of traditional indigenous territories and places like Halmahera Island in Indonesia, right? That to me, it creates a picture that is, it exposes the moral bankruptcy of that approach. And I think there are, this is a long-winded answer, but I think it's a great question, Andrea. So hopefully this is interesting to you. I think there are two different reasons for it. And one is that people are true believers. I think a lot of people are true believers in the values of Western civilization's modernity and what it brings. And I think that when you have true believers in something, they can justify atrocity in order to push forward their agenda. And I think that we are seeing that with green technology around the world today. We're seeing it at Thacker Pass. We're seeing it on Halmahera. We're seeing it, in Serbia and all these places where these issues are coming to the front. This sort of new battleground in the environmental movement, in the destruction of the planet. And I think the second point, I think true believers is one, and I think the second point is that I think some people are making a modest green transition, perhaps not in good faith completely, perhaps with the understanding that they are sacrificing, that they, how do I put this? That they are deliberately making a choice to advocate for policies which are popular rather than for the truth. And that's something that politicians do all the time. And it's a great way to get more votes. And I think it's a terrible way to move forward. I think that the truth will always come out. And regardless of the fact that many truths are uncomfortable and even disturbing and dangerous, I think it's always better to tell the truth than to move forward with a lie. And I think that there are likely some people who are focusing on this idea of a modest green transition as a political tool to move forward their agenda, which may be very worthwhile in some ways. I think that those people, if they are doing that, likely see themselves as working to halt the destruction of the planet, to slow down the destruction of the planet, to scale down the impacts, and so on. And I can completely understand why they would make that choice. I don't think it's the right choice, but it makes sense because, as Bill Reese said in the first presentation in the series, the ecologically necessary is often politically infeasible. And that's the situation that we're dealing with in the West, is that the policies that we actually would need to start moving towards a sustainable world are politically untenable at this point. But the only way that you shift the Overton window, that you start to make those type of policies acceptable, is you talk about it and you tell the truth. And so that's why I do the work that I do. And that's why I think it's really important for all of us to talk about these things and to do serious political organizing, community organizing, education, outreach, and so on these issues. Thank you. Thank you.
I appreciate the long answer. Thank you.
Yeah, glad you're here.
Well, one more question for you, Max. This week, the UNFCCC, which is the United Nations Framework for Convention on Climate Change, COP, Conference of Parties, is trying to wrap up in Dubai. And the news from the COP has been tripling renewables and tripling nuclear capacity and arguing over whether we're going to phase out or phase down or neither of fossil fuels. And it's just astonishing to me to continue to see the leaders of, I mean, pretty much every country in the world is there arguing over those things rather than sort of this bigger picture that you've showed us tonight. And when I see things like that in the media, I despair for how we're going to get through. Politically infeasible is an understatement. So I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on that.
I'm so upset that I'm spilling water all over myself. Well, I mean, it's a complete farce, and all the COP conferences have been for so many years. I saw that there was a program on responsible yachting as part of the COP conference this past week. Tim Garrett, who is a physicist at the University of Utah who studies climate, ecology, collapse, civilization, the interplay of all these different issues. He actually creates models that are, kind of different from the models that IPCC and climate scientists use to analyze how global warming is going to play out. He produces these models that look at global warming, but also look at civilization as a whole from a more of a thermodynamics perspective, rather than, I don't know what you call the IPCC and the climate models. I've heard the term before, but all these models with all these complex variables. And he says that the outcome from COP28 is, quote, the absolute worst possible outcome, because he believes that increasing renewable energy and increasing energy efficiency will actually only accelerate fossil fuel consumption and increase the growth rate of industrial civilization, so accelerate us faster into ecological collapse. We write about Jevons paradox in Bright Green Lies, and we write about the fact that, as I said earlier in this presentation, that the renewable energy is just being added on top of the fossil fuel energy. And actually, in some situations, I showed that coal mine in Germany where the wind power is being used by the machines at the coal mine. There are actually many situations like this around the world where you have major industrial facilities like mines, oil wells, and so on that are being powered. I think there's a massive new offshore oil or wind turbine, wind energy facility array going in the North Sea, and that's going to be used to power oil drilling and extract oil pumping in the North Sea. So this is not sort of this is not a something that I'm making up. This energy is often being directly used to power the increased extraction of fossil fuels and the destruction of the planet, because it's much more convenient to do so that way. It's a more efficient way to power an industrial economy, and of course, this is why the energy policy under Obama was explicitly called all of the above. So he promoted solar, nuclear, wind, natural gas, coal, oil, all of it, because the more energy, the more economic growth, the more economic growth, the more jobs, the more jobs, the more votes, et cetera, right? So yes, I think that what's happening at COP is an absolute travesty. I think that people need to I think I used to be an advocate of people going to these conferences and protesting. Now I think that people just need to ignore that type of thing completely and just do our own organizing work that is completely separate and independent from that work. Sure, we can educate about what's going on there, the greenwashing and so on. I think that can be important. But, personally, I would avoid going to a place like that and even protesting, because I would feel like, why am I even here? Like, I could be spending this time to be proactively organizing resistance or alternatives, those two different wings of the movement I think that we need, back in my community or in a place where it's probably more necessary to do so than around some big convention that amounts to a fair, a growth fair for major world economies and green tech corporations.
Yeah. Agreed.
Yeah.
Do you have time for a couple more questions?
Absolutely, yeah. I'm happy to take as many as there are.
Okay, awesome. We had a question from Bert. I often come to problems like this through the lens of self-determination theory. Simply put, the most resilient, long-lasting form of motivation is intrinsic. Less powerful extrinsic motivation, things like fear, I don't think are going to win the hearts and minds of the people we need to motivate. So do you know of initiatives to help cultivate people's intrinsic motivations to take action concerning overshoot?
I'm looking up a quote that I wanted to read. It's from an old school sort of deep ecologist conservationist, John Livingston, who wrote a bunch of books, including The Fallacy of Wildlife Conservation. And he says, quote, "On the basis of some experience in conservation affairs, I am at last persuaded that mere argument as such is entirely worthless. Argument, it seems to me, is never going to help wildlife. It rarely has, and there is little to persuade me that it ever will. I believe that wildlife preservation is entirely dependent on individual human experience." And I bring that up, Bert, because yeah, I absolutely have the same understanding and experience. I don't think people are generally motivated by fear. I think they're often paralyzed by fear. And I think that the the two biggest reasons why people aren't doing more to defend the planet is, one, because at some level many people recognize that we're dependent on the system that's killing the planet. And so I think we have a lot of loyalty towards that system, which is why I think the building the alternatives is necessary, not just for the sake of having the alternatives, but for the sake of freeing our minds from that sort of psychological allegiance to the system. When the first time I went out and foraged wild mushrooms or acorns, or started to understand that I could get food directly from the land itself and not the grocery store, that started to create more of a sense of freedom from industrial agriculture than I could access by reading any number of books or watching any number of movies or something like that, right? It becomes a lived experience. And that changes what people believe is possible, and what people are willing to do. And then, oh, I totally lost my train of thought. I'm getting tired. uh, yeah, and I think that the okay, the intrinsic motivations. Yeah, so John Livingston, the personal experience, the lived experience of the natural world. So I think that's a really key part of what's going on. And I think the other reason why people aren't taking action is just out of paralysis. I think people are absolutely paralyzed, petrified, um, in a state of existential grief and loss over what's happening to the planet, of terror at what is coming. And um, human beings can go through a lot when we're together with our community, with people we love, with people we care for. And when we can talk and process our emotions together and do ceremony and sing and dance and do whatever the things we need to do to live, right? To have a good life. But when we're alienated, when we're alone, when we're isolated, when we're in a culture that tells us that it's not polite to talk about these issues, um, and when people can only really deal with them in private and are bombarded in mainstream media with these stories about the crisis, linked with these completely disempowering narratives about how corporations are going to solve the problem and green technology is going to save us, but then the problems keep getting worse and the headlines are worse the next day than they were the day before. It's just the most disempowering thing you could imagine. So I think we're really in a sort of Pavlov's dogs type situation where, you know, learned helplessness is being impressed forcibly upon the entire population by, you know, mass media and the culture we live in. It's just sort of the air we breathe is learned helplessness, especially in the wealthy Western nations. I think ironically, um, people in a lot of people outside the US often seem to have a much greater sense of their own political power than we do here, and a greater sense of the fact that, you know, I'm a human being, God damn it, I have rights, I have a voice, I have a say in this society, and no matter what you know, regulations are placed on me, no matter what I'm supposed to do, I'm going to make that voice heard and try and shift things in a better direction, because I'm a human being and I have value, right? Um, and ironically, that seems to have largely been lost in our culture, at least in regards to the ecological issue. And I think there's a lot of reasons to that, to why that is the case. I think a lot of it has to do with the fracturing of our society and, excuse me, sort of the deliberate polarization into factions of our society, that are then pitted against each other to fight over all kinds of different, you know, largely social issues, but also environmental issues. To I think that's been really effective in fragmenting our ability to deal with these issues. So I'm not answering your question. Do you know of initiatives to help cultivate people's intrinsic motivations to take action concerning overshoot? I don't know that specifically. I'm sure there are many that I could think of if we sat down and had a longer conversation about that. But in my work, I've always tried to focus on encouraging that direct relationship to the natural world, like John Livingston talked about, as a key piece of it, because I think it starts to give access to that feeling of independence from the industrial system. And it also cultivates in people love. It cultivates love. You know, it's impossible to go out to, you know, to walk through a beautiful old growth forest out to a wilderness beach and sit there around a fire and watch the sunset and not understand that that place is sacred and deserves to be protected at some level, you know, and to be connected to it. It's, well, I should say almost impossible. um, uh, you know, but that's not an experience that is encouraged in our society by and large. There's actually, sorry, I got a big mouth. I'll go on for hours in Q&A if I can. But just one experience I'll share about that is I used to live in Utah. And when I lived there, my friend was she had studied outdoor recreation and she got a job working for the governor's office. They had a new office of outdoor recreation for the state of Utah, because, you know, Utah is a big place for hiking and biking and rock climbing and the canyons and the Red Rock and all that stuff. Jeep, you know, riding your Jeeps through the Red Rock, and outdoor recreation is a huge part of the economy. So they had this new office of outdoor recreation and she worked in that office. And they had a funding bill that was coming up for renewal in the state legislature. And that funding bill was passed, but the right-wing dominated legislature made a change to it, which was they took out funding for children's outdoor recreation programs. They did not want that in the bill. And I think there are two sort of clear reasons for that. One, which is more straightforward, and one, which is more ideological, I think, and perhaps even wasn't perceived by those people. But the more obvious one is that kids don't spend money, right? So kids aren't going to be a major economic boon to the state of Utah. They're not going to rent hotel rooms and, you know, buy fancy dinners and fill up their Jeeps with gas and so on, right? So unlike a lot of outdoor recreation constituencies, kids just aren't going to bring in tax revenue and boost the local economies. So, and two, and this I think is more important and telling, is that when you bring, so many outdoor educators have known about this for years. And I say this as somebody who's guided a lot of kids out into the wilderness over the years. When you bring kids out into nature and you just provide a basic, safe environment for them to explore and have fun and do what they're going to do, they fall in love with the natural world generally. And I think that at some level, those legislators saw funding a program like that as a long-term threat to the ideological project of growth and the extraction of resources from the planet. And so they took away the funding from it. So I think that that type of very basic environmental education work is really important ultimately, and it's long-term work. It doesn't have a quick return, but I think that, you know, every kid in the world should have an opportunity to go to wild places and to spend time there and build relationships with wild animals and watch wildlife and be alone and watch the stars come up and sit around campfires and you know, and get a chance to have those experiences. Hopefully that's helpful, Bert.
Thank you very much for that answer. I think that's a great point to end on. Love for the natural world. All right. I'm going to put some links to Max's writing into the chat if you'd like to explore more of his writing. He has his own website, he has a Substack, and then of course there's Protect Thacker Pass. And yeah, that wraps up our series. You're the last of 3 in this series on ecological overshoot, and I'm truly grateful to you, Max, for presenting, and also to the other 2 speakers. And I'm really looking forward to the conversations to come about ecological overshoot. So thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Beth, and thanks everyone for coming. I dropped my email in the chat too, so if anyone wants to reach out to me, feel free. I'm pretty slow on email, so I can't promise I'll get back to you quickly, but I will eventually.
Great. Thanks so much, everybody, and thank you, Max. All right. Good night.
Take care, everyone.